Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the T.H.O. Movie Reviews podcast, the show where we bring you passionate, honest, and insightful film criticism. I'm your host, Bennett Campbell Ferguson, and I'm here today at Rose City Coffee Co., Brooklyn Park, to talk about our favorite remakes and reboots of all time. And to help me get the job done, I've got a couple of my wonderful colleagues here, starting with Patrick Belin. Patrick, you came up with this whole thing. You masterminded it from the beginning. Are you ready to do something rebootiful?
Rebootiful. Well, hello everybody. It's me again. Always coming back for more. I thought this would be a pretty interesting podcast. What was the last one we did again? The sequels?
We did something after that, didn't we? The last thing you did was the Dark Knight commentary.
Oh yeah, that's right.
The last thing Mo and I did was Solo.
Yeah,
that was
fine.
It was a thing.
It was a thing that happened. Both the podcast and the movie.
And speaking of which, also here we have Mo Shaunette. Mo, you've got your bagel. You've got a Night Vale t-shirt. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready as I'll ever be. You know, the country's on fire, but thank God for movies.
Oh yeah.
Oh.
Amen to that. Well, let's kick it off. And what I want to do first is when we did our podcast about our favorite sequels of all time, which all of you should go watch, by the way, if you haven't already, we actually found, it was kind of the twist ending at the end of the podcast, that we all actually had very different definitions of what a sequel was. And it was a fun conversation to kind of get into the minutia of how do you define a sequel. So this time I thought I'd front load that, and I thought we could talk about what a remake is kind of a self-explanatory concept, but a reboot not so much. It's kind of nebulous. There are lots of different kinds of reboots. So I just wanted to hear from you guys. How would you define what a reboot is?
I think the goal of I think for me a reboot is something that's pulling from the same, central creative place, but is aiming to take the idea, for lack of a better non-capitalist word, franchise, into a different direction. So that would be something like, and something could be a remake and a reboot, or a remake and a reboot and a sequel, or something like that. So something like Star Wars The Force Awakens is a sequel, but it's also a reboot because it's aiming to highlight a new cast, new creative team, new effects, and take the story in a new direction. We've had at least 2 reboots of Spider-Man in the past however many years, and it's a similar thing, but it's not a direct remake of the first Spider-Man movie or any specific Spider-Man comics. So it is kind of nebulous, I'll agree, but for me it feels like it's taking this familiar idea into a new direction.
Patrick?
I think my thinking is similar lines as Mo's thinking. I think like you said, I think a remake is pretty self-explanatory. When I think remake, the example that comes to mind is quite a while ago, Gus Van Sant's remake of Hitchcock's Psycho. He almost went with the exact same shots and everything. That's, to me, the most obvious example of a remake. But again, with a reboot, the lines are a little blurred there, right? There are different types of reboots. But the one aspect that I keep returning to, especially in terms of what remakes and reboots have in common, is that there's a very strong nostalgia factor in a remake and a reboot. Like this creative source hasn't been introduced in a while, or it's been a while since it's been introduced to popular audiences, and that's what makes remakes and reboots so unique. But going back to a reboot, I think it's not just nostalgia, but when it reboots the whole thing, it also introduces something new. What the example that comes to mind for me is Batman, Tim Burton's Batman versus Christopher Nolan's Batman. I mean, they're both.
Burton's Batman was a reboot in a way as well.
Right. I mean, it's that's probably the ultimate example of a franchise that's constantly being rebooted. And then they're even as a side note, they're talking about rebooting Batman again as if we really need one.
Yeah,
Anyways,
with the Matt Reeves.
yeah, that's
film.
another conversation. But going back to this example of nostalgia, I mean, with Batman, we already know the character. He's a well-defined character, but with Tim Burton's Batman, to me that was a very more comic booky, more campy interpretation of Batman, whereas Chris Nolan, several years later, kind of went the opposite direction and
It's almost just like a normal crime movie with Batman in it.
put it into this gritty realism.
That's the weird thing. When Batman first came out, it's like the '89 version, people loved it because it was so dark and gothic, and like Batman before then had been the Adam West series,
right?
And that was the campy one, and now we consider the Burton films as being the more silly version.
So we have three generations of Batman now, right? We have the Adam
Lots
West
of Batman.
We have 4 generations of Batman because now we have Batfleck.
Is that
for how long?
Just the mention of his name, I can just feel like a pall settling over the table.
I heard they pulled the plug on Batfleck. And
He's definitely
he's playing
out.
coy. I imagine at this point he's under contract, and so it's like, no, I'm totally happy to do another Batman movie. Wink.
I've heard he's been out for I think over a year, but it's one of those things where he had to put on a brave face because you wouldn't want Justice League in theaters while he's yo done, this sucks.
Yeah. If we start talking about the DCEU, we're going to be here all
exactly.
day.
But I have one more point to make about because Mo brought up Force Awakens, which is an excellent example because you and I talked about that before on the phone.
That's right.
With the Force Awakens,
Yeah.
I'm still kind of internally conflicted about this, thinking about this in the last couple of weeks. Where can a reboot also be a sequel? Can it exist along the same lines as a sequel, or is a reboot completely its own thing and tries to introduce something new?
Well, it by definition can't be its own thing because it's pulling from existing material.
I mean,
it's how much do you acknowledge the existing material.
Right.
So, another example, we're already getting into this discussion. Another example is Doctor Who, which got rebooted in 2005, and it's just a continuation of the first series. It's the same continuity, and they have callbacks, acknowledgments, and a few actors reprising old roles and getting spin-off series.
Isn't rebooting almost kind of built into the DNA of Doctor Who since the character regenerates? So recasting is actually almost in the script, really.
Yeah. So it's a weird nebulous kind of thing. We'll get into that later.
I mean, you can almost say that they're just different types of reboots. There's a reboot that exists as a sequel, and there's a reboot that is not a sequel.
Yep. Well, I want to speak to that because how I define a reboot is I define it as there's two kinds of reboots. There's soft reboots and there's hard reboots. I think a soft reboot would be something like The Force Awakens, where it is a sequel. It's a sequel to Return of the Jedi. It's picking up where Return of the Jedi left off. But at the same time, it's resetting the status quo dramatically in a way that, makes it easy for even people who aren't familiar with the whole saga to enter into it, And I think that's the case. I think that's, The Force Awakens sold more tickets than even The Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Jedi, certainly more than The Phantom Menace. So I think part of that was because you do a soft reboot, suddenly things seem more accessible, the mythology seems less tangled. Whereas I think it's different with a hard reboot, which is what I would describe something like Batman Begins as being, because that's also shaking up the status quo in a significant way, but it's literally wiping the slate clean. It's I remember I think there was some talk before Batman Begins came out it doesn't necessarily conflict with the Burton films because it's earlier in Batman's life. Well, once we all saw that, we knew the exact opposite was true. The Burton films do not exist. Christian Bale said, before the film came out, in my mind, this is the first one, although he probably said it like, in my mind, this is the first one.
And then he yelled at a lighting guy.
Exactly. What don't you fucking understand? But I think, that's the difference between the hard reboot, the soft reboot, and, you guys are right, it is a nebulous concept, and the concept really revolves on the difference between can you reboot within continuity, or do you have to, sweep all the continuity into the rug, And both have worked at varying times.
I don't know. I mean, I'm reaching the point where I think that like you're kind of distinguishing between soft and hard reboots. I think they just kind of coexist. I mean, there's no real hard dividing line or what really defines a reboot in this sense. I think there is kind of like a soft and a hard version.
Yeah. Well,
I've got a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment since we're talking about Force Awakens.
Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, this is about remakes too. Is Force Awakens a remake or a reboot?
Actually, Force Awakens is something entirely different. I apologize for reusing this joke, but I love it so much that I'm going to do it. Force Awakens is neither. It's really, yes, it's a soft reboot, but what it really is a game of Star Wars Mad Libs. Insert indestructible planet-destroying weapon here. Insert cute droid here. Insert secret information that cute droid is carrying here. Insert orphan in the desert scavenging. Sorry,
it's like it doesn't try to explicitly remake Episode 4, right? The way Van Sant remade Psycho, but it gives you this wink, like. This is the Star Wars that you've seen before,
More than anything else, it's an apology for the prequels.
Something like that. I mean, what's funny is that, I don't know, well, that's just my personal thing, but I'm not too harsh on the prequels as much as I used to be.
I've outgrown that. I was never really in that, because when the prequels were coming out, I was just having fun watching Star Wars movies.
Sure.
Granted, I was a dumb kid at the time, so I would tune out everything except lightsaber fights.
That was kind of how I was too.
And then you find out about the backlash of it, and it's like, okay. I mean, by the point I found out about that, and that was a big thing, they had stopped being made. So I really just did not care.
I mean, like my thing is I'm sort of since we're talking about the prequels, we may as well talk prequels for a second.
Because that is kind of a soft reboot too.
Well, yeah. The Phantom Menace was a soft reboot.
Yeah.
Absolutely, it reset the status quo.
At some point, we're going to actually start this conversation in earnest. I swear.
Someday. But for me, I'm of two minds. On the one hand, there's so many things that bother me. From Hayden Christensen's performance to the fake CGI lava in lieu of an actual story, to the fart jokes and the Phantom Menace. On the other hand, I was at the same place you were, Mo, when I saw those films. I was a kid just enjoying the lightsaber fights, and I find I'm literally two people when I watch the prequels now. There's the kind of older me, kind of sneering at midi-chlorians. And but I still have that kid inside me. When Darth Maul lights up his double-bladed lightsaber, I still go, that's badass, man.
That was the tightest shit, I swear to God.
It was.
There's a reason why they keep bringing him back. Of all the characters in the prequels, he's the one who survives.
Even though even getting cut in half couldn't stop him.
Yeah.
Well, let's
tough SOB, I swear to God.
Well, let's start talking some reboots and remakes. We're gonna go around the panel. We each picked 5. We're gonna talk about them 2 at a time, and then we'll, for the very last one, we'll go do that one at a time. So who's got 2 remakes or 2 reboots, or a remake and a reboot?
Just a disclaimer. It's 1 to 5, but it's not really ranked from best to worst so much. It's pretty loose in that regard. But 2 that I want to start with are a little more recent. So I'll go with Abrams' Star Trek that came out a while ago, and not a little closer, maybe Creed, the boxing sequel, Rocky sequel.
Now that is a sequel and a reboot and a spin-off.
The triple threat.
Some kinds of nonsense going on here.
Yeah,
and if you look at the basis of a Rocky movie structure, it's probably a remake too.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
I mean, it exists in that exact same timeline and everything, universe.
Yeah. So why those two? What do you like about those two?
Well, first of all, since we're talking about this definition thing, the first thing that I that comes to mind is all the ducks have to be in a row, right? Like in filmmaking wise, directing, acting, all these things. So, in terms of my top 5, all of them are films that I enjoy, that I rated very highly, and of course we're doing reboots and remakes. So, of course, that's the 2 films that I chose, and that just really worked for me and fit that criteria. So.
It's interesting, like, Abrams' film is a great example of a movie that kind of reboots within continuity, because it actually still exists alongside, the original Trek timeline, because, you have time travel and alternate reality and stuff versus Creed, which is an evolution of, what we saw before, and it's kind of, a direct offshoot of that mythology. That's kind of an interesting contrast.
Mm-hmm.
I'm personally still confused as to how this Star Trek timelines work. With the reboots and the original timeline, it's just too much for me. I haven't really spent too much time thinking about
Why
it.
is Khan white now?
That's the question. Man.
It's like alternate universe Star Wars, Star Trek or something.
Yeah.
But let me ask you this, like. I haven't seen Creed, but I've seen.
How have you not seen Creed? That movie came out like 3 years ago.
I know. I feel terrible. I need to see it, and I love Ryan Coogler, so I got to see it. But I've seen Trek more times than I can count, and I don't want to talk about it too much because I'm going to talk about it later. But I mean, like, what do you think? Like the Abrams. And Coogler like brought to those franchises that maybe hadn't been done before, because I can't speak to Creed, but I can certainly speak to Star Trek. For me, that was the first Star Trek film that felt like it was made by like a real movie guy, because I love a lot of the films that came before it, but they, to some extent, they still felt like a little bit theatrical, a little bit like television. And then, suddenly you've got Abrams. He's moving the camera like crazy. The drama is much more heightened and cinematic. So there's a big change.
A shit ton of lens flares.
Absolutely.
So the point that so I'll go back to these 2 movies. But the first point that I want to make about Abrams' Star Trek is, I think prior to that movie, the whole Star Trek franchise seems, in my opinion, to have been catering to the Trekkie, the traditional Trekkie,
mm-hmm.
The fanboy of the Star Trek universe. Whereas when Abrams came around, he kind of turned the franchise into something that's more palatable to general audiences and not just the Trek fanboys. That's how I view that. That's what Abrams brought to the table, in my opinion. And going back to Creed, I feel like prior to Coogler's Creed, the Rocky franchise has been kind of this 80s thing, like Sylvester Stallone. A lot of the politics was still in the Cold War era, fighting someone from the USSR and stuff like that.
Well, for me, like when I watched the original Rocky, it's now kind of awkward because it feels so dated.
Yeah, it feels very dated. Whereas if with Creed, it's centered on an entirely new character, and it takes into account the current world that we live in, the 2015, 2016 world that we live in, and it redefines that universe.
Do you say that because it's taking a story that was originally about a white guy and his white guy issues to shifting to Michael B. Jordan's perspective, but also the Tessa Thompson character as well? I mean, is that part of that?
It takes that entire universe and for lack of a better word, freshens it up, and
Sure.
makes it more relevant to modern day audiences. or current audiences.
Words to live by. And I will see Creed. I will. I promise. I'll get to it. Mo, tell us about your first two picks.
My first two, with my five, I tried to do 5 ones that at least have something different about them, that they're different flavors of reboot or remake, that they're coming from different perspectives, or at least lead to different, bigger discussions. So for my number 5 pick, and again, I'm much like Patrick, this is not ranked in terms of my favorites. This is just the order they came to mind, and was like, I want to talk about this sort of thing. So take that as you will. So my first pick would be 2010's True Grit, directed by the Coen brothers, which was a remake of an old Western from, what was it, 1962 or something?
I don't know that.
It was
that
like
sounds right.
it was sometime in the 60s, and that was
But the John Wayne.
the John Wayne
Ford
version,
film.
the movie that got John Wayne his Oscar. And that, you can kind of call it a remake, but also you can call it a reinterpretation, because both of them were based on a book. And the Coen brothers version, they said up front, we're not here to do another version of the John Wayne movie, we're here to do another version of the book. And so it has a lot more in common with that, because I watched both in anticipation of the remake. I watched the original, and it does feel like it has more in common with these ideas in the book. It's rougher, it's more gritty and down to earth. There's in the original, John Wayne, he plays Rooster Cogburn with this sense of mirth, and he ends it with literally running off into the sunset. And in the remake, he's a much more complicated figure. They acknowledge, like, yeah, he's good at what he does, but he's also drunk all the time. He's violent. He's short-tempered. He's not a nice fella, but he's really helpful. And it is a stark contrast, and it's that to me is interesting. Is the idea of looping back to an original source and finding what made it work, and then just trying to bring that to light again. And on a similar token, another one of my favorite remakes would be, reboots would be Rise of the Planet of the Apes. Because it's weird that series does not get more love than it does. Like, it's a block.
I know, for something that's so critically acclaimed, it actually feels kind of underrated.
Yeah, like, it's a blockbuster. Every time it comes out, people seem to like the movies. But it doesn't, it's like not a barn burner, it's not blowing down the doors, so what's up with that? But it is like this central idea of just the image of apes uprising and taking over the earth. It's a powerful image, and there's some to that, but rather than being about like this post-apocalyptic world and a modern man stuck in it, it's a story of a marginalized group rising up against their oppressors.
Yeah.
And you flip the narrative, you root for the apes to take down humanity. Like, that's where we're at. And it makes a much more complex figure out of Caesar. It's got groundbreaking special effects. The first one had really fantastic makeup and costuming and prosthetics, and I'm not going to say those don't look great, because they really do. Like, even today, they work. But just the motion capture technology and Andy Serkis's performance, and the performance of all the other actors, it looks phenomenal. And it's looping back to this central idea and seeing where we can take it, seeing what we can do with it. And what they do with it is really interesting.
I want to speak to some of that, because I think, like what you're talking about rooting for the apes, is I think so interesting, and I feel the same way. I felt that way watching Rise and Dawn of the Planet of the Apes and War for the Planet of the Apes as well, and I felt like kind of like the opposite of Avatar, like where it's like I think I may be in the minority, but the scenes I like best in the Avatar are the kind of the non CGI heavy scenes, because I feel like Sam Worthington, as limited an actor as he is still, more compelling just sitting in a wheelchair talking to the camera than these kind of video game looking characters that Weta dreamed up, and that are just so stylized. Whereas like watching War for the Planet of the Apes, I felt that Caesar was no less commanding than Woody Harrelson as the Colonel. And that's extraordinary. And because what you're talking about, that the idea of the apes as a marginalized group rising up against oppressors, that doesn't work without the best special effects of this generation. Does it?
It's what I think that just this. I'm going on a tangent now. Look at me. But I think this speaks to this idea of a lot of people like to praise practical effects over CGI, and there's something to that. I'm not going to deny that there is something more to making. There's something more engaging to something that's actually real on screen as opposed to just bits and pixels. The thing is, it takes a lot to shoot it right.
Yeah.
Like that's the issue with prosthetics. Someone described it as Rick Baker's effects in, say, The Thing look phenomenal, but they only look phenomenal from one specific angle. And so you do need a filmmaker who's gonna work to find the right way to shoot it and find the right way to set up a shot and compose it, as opposed to CGI. There's something freeing in that, and you can do pretty much anything with it. And you can create these fantastical worlds, and they can suck people in. We're still in 2018. Most of Wakanda looked fake, but it was phenomenal nonetheless because it looks so naturalistic.
Yeah. Well, I think that's interesting because I see sort of the Apes films as the perfect blend of old and new, because you do have this extraordinary CGI. I mean, just the eyes, the fur, the movement has real like weight and texture, all that. But at the same time, it's like, they were shooting on like real locations, so those those CGI creations are like held to the standard of those real locations, as opposed real snow, real dirt, real trees, as opposed to something like, I keep bashing Avatar, but Pandora. What standard do you hold those characters to this fake made up land that looks like a screensaver? It's I don't know. It's a I love the Apes films. I'm really glad you chose Rise.
I can't really comment much on your Mo's two choices because I haven't seen the new Apes movies, and secondly, I haven't seen the true remake or the original. But full disclosure, I was kind of a fanboy of the old Apes movies. To me, they're a little bit like they're a little bit like Star Trek. They're kind of niche-y sci-fi. But there's very strong social commentary in them that's inherent in them. If you look beyond this whole, make-believe world of apes thinking like humans, etc., the social commentary inherent in that series is very interesting to me.
Absolutely.
Which is why I was such a fanboy of the originals. And eventually I'll get to the new Apes movies.
Yeah.
Well, going on to my first two picks, I did rank them. These are in order of preference. I'll be ending with my favorite reboot. So number 5 for me is Batman Begins, and before I talk about that, I should say that I'm going to be talking about these in kind of a unique way. A lot of them are films I've talked about before, so I thought, how can I address these in a different way than I've addressed them before? And I thought that for me, I really enjoy looking at specific scenes, and I thought, okay, I'm going to pick a specific scene from each of these. And that really kind of explains why I love the movie. So for Batman Begins, I picked the scene after Wayne Manor has been set ablaze by Ra's al Ghul. And Christian Bale and Michael Caine are escaped. They go down the elevator into the Batcave. And Bruce Wayne is looking up through the elevator shaft at his house burning down, and just realizing how destroyed his family legacy is, and saying to Alfred, what have I done? My family, everything my father built. he's totally beat, he's totally lost, and then Alfred says to him the same words that Bruce's father said to him: "Why do we fall? So we can learn how to pick ourselves up." And that for me sums up what I love not only about Batman Begins but about the entire Dark Knight trilogy, because I feel like it wasn't successful because of the darkness or the grittiness, or frankly even because of Heath Ledger. It was successful because at its core it's about very human primal things. It's about growing up. It's about fathers and sons. It's about overcoming despair and finding the inner strength to keep going. And I think that's a really beautiful moment. And the other film, number 4, is Casino Royale, which I'm a really big fan of. And the scene I picked for that is
it the one where James Bond gets hit in the balls?
It's whenever I watch that scene, I of course wince. But actually, that scene is a big part of why I like the movie, because it's a movie with some teeth. I mean, it's like it a lot of blockbusters, I think you can just sort of sit back and watch kind of passively. It's like whatever. And this is one that it literally gives you a kick in the crotch. Pardon the pun. It's
What's interesting? Sorry to interrupt you, but what's interesting is that your two choices were released roughly in the same generation.
That's right.
Films.
That's right. Yeah. Well, they both have a similar kind of back to basics. Bring it down to earth ethos. But the scene in Casino Royale that I chose is when Bond meets Ava Green's character Vesper Lind on the train for the first time. And it's this really incredible scene where she sits down across from him, and they engage in kind of this verbal battle where they're sort of studying each other's, manner and clothes, and using that to guess at details about one another. She looks at his suit and deduces that he went to Oxford, but he didn't come from money. He got there by someone else's generosity. He looks at her clothes and says, "Oh, your clothes are slightly masculine. You're trying to be taken seriously." And I love that scene, the idea of we never confirm if what they're saying is true, but the idea of them getting to know each other and getting this insight into one another from just observing these little details. And I think that's so important because it's the beginning of not just the typical Bond movie romance where they indulge in not so thinly veiled dirty talk, and it's all fun and slightly tawdry. It's the beginning of a real romance. Of Bond actually having genuine feelings for another person, and that's what I think made Casino Royale so great. Was it took a character who was very heightened and kind of a sort of a male fantasy gone wild,
Absolutely.
And it said...
And Colonial's fantasy gone wild.
Absolutely. And Casino Royale was the movie that said, what if we treat this character like a human being? What if we, actually think about his thought process? And not only that, but what if we critique him? What if we don't hold him up as this perfect hero? What if we make part of the plot Bond looking at his life and saying, do I really want to do this? And Ava Green's character is a big part of that. And that's why I love Casino Royale.
Oh, I'm glad you brought in Casino Royale in this, because I think it kind of gives way to my definition of reboots not just being nostalgic, but they bring something new to the table. And when I think of Casino Royale, it compared to the Bond movies that came before, it kind of takes the Bond character outside of Bond for a moment and tries to humanize the character a little bit and show kind of how he became Bond in the first place.
Yeah. Well, and I think you bring up a great point. None of these movies mean a damn unless you bring something new to the table. I think we can all agree that Andrew Garfield Spider-Man movie sucked. And the reason it sucked was because, there are a lot of reasons, but this is one. One reason it sucked is because it was, it brought some new things to the table, but it didn't bring enough new to the table. It was still, kind of playing to these same beats it's funny, I find it funny how, with great power comes great responsibility is a line that went from being revered to actually being kind of mocked. And the reason, and it's a really beautiful line. I love it. I love it unironically and unequivocally. But the reason it came to that point was because it was so laughable, trying to see like Martin Sheen say that,
like,
but without
work around it.
Yeah, work around it. And it's like, but it was like, it was still like playing the same card. It's like drawing from the same playbook. And it's just, if you're not gonna like deliver something new, well then why bother with a reboot? Why should we pay for that? Because that's not worth our time or our money if they're just throwing the same crap at us.
I heard a critic describe Spider-Man, the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man, as filmmaking by accountants. Like it doesn't.
Absolutely, that's fair.
It doesn't exist to. It doesn't exist to progress a story or to bring some new idea or some new technology. It barely exists to make money. It exists to keep Spider-Man in the Sony house.
Yeah, and and before we move on, one thing I would add to that is that film was announced. I believe it was late 2009, early 2010.
Sounds right.
So around the time that the second Twilight movie broke box office records, and Avatar, of course, blew the doors off, theaters across the world. And what do you know? After those movies are successful, Sony announces, we're taking Spider-Man back to high school, and it's going to be in 3D. Oh, gee, I wonder where they got those ideas. But that's I think it all comes down to the thing, even with reboots, even when you're dealing with intellectual property, yes, it's the film business, but you can't make a movie purely for business because, people will know. People will, smell the crap. And that's why, again, there's got to be something fresh, and, which is why I think, all the films we've talked about so far, that's what they're on these lists, because they're delivered in that way.
So if I were to distill this little rant that we just went on, the PSA would be, the movies have to justify their own existence beyond just making a quick buck.
Yes.
So if anybody working in Hollywood right now listen to this, please make sure the film justifies its own fucking existence.
I couldn't agree more. And you asked a really interesting question in the sequels podcast, which was, are sequels innocent or guilty until proven innocent? And in a way, I think all movies are.
That's just bad faith criticism, and that gets into CinemaSins territory, and I do not want to be like CinemaSins because they are garbage.
I disagree. I disagree, and I'll tell you why. I think, yes, I want to like every movie I see. Absolutely. I never want to have a bad experience. Well, sometimes I do, if I'm going to see The Mummy. But I want to have like a so bad it's good experience. But, I feel that every movie has to justify its existence, doesn't it? You walk in, you want to walk out feeling like I didn't, just waste $10.
But that's not exactly a black and white point, I think, because it's a little subjective, right? Some people are interested in certain topics and some people are just not. So if you're not interested in it at all, then even no matter how great it was, then you're just not going to like it. So, it's not necessarily a black and white thing, I think.
Well, but actually, I found that a really great movie can make me interested in something I never thought I'd be interested in.
That's a great movie.
Yeah, I was telling you guys, before we started recording about The Writer. And, I didn't, I never thought about the rodeo before I saw, The Rider. I never thought about what, rodeo guys go through and the danger involved. That's not something that's interesting to me. I'm afraid of horses. I'm too scared to ride a horse, But, this movie made me care about the rodeo and think like, wow, that's actually quite a journey. So I think, But I'm getting further away. But
that's a fair point, and I think that's one aspect of what makes a great film versus a good film. I think.
Yeah.
But it can make you interested in that way.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, this is going to end part 1 of this podcast. Check out part 2. It'll be posted around the same time. If you like this, please click thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to like us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at T.H.O Movie Reviews and check out all the great reviews and content we have at thomoviereviews.wordpress.com. Once again, I'm your host, Bennett Campbell Ferguson. I'm here with Mo Shaunette. I'm here with Patrick Belin. And from all of us here at T.H.O. Movie Reviews, happy rebooting.